All right. Hello, this is Group 10, and today we are going to be talking about the power and manipulation of Uber. And I'm Barrett Paul. I'll start off. So, first, I'm going to talk about how Uber ultimately overcomes their failures to find success. So, to start off, we'll start about their main failures. Their first failure was their executive orders. So basically, Uber had a bad start with some of their executive decisions within the company, um, such as some of them did not want to make regulations to launch their operations and therefore had backlashes with the government and also their image. So basically, they just weren't following regulations right away, and we're just starting the company off kind of on the wrong foot. Second off, another failure was their lawsuit losses. So they had many lawsuits, which we'll cover later on in this presentation. But one of them was created by taxi unions, which are still being created towards Uber to this day. So that is just one thing that Uber has not done so well with starting off, is just all the lawsuits they've had to deal with. Thirdly, they have had a lot of cybersecurity holes. So one of the biggest scandals was when customers and delivery drivers' information, personal identity information, was leaked out to the public, and therefore was a pretty big deal, and did not look very good for Uber. And so that would be another big failure that they had starting off. Fourthly, they had a blemished physical safety record. So another larger scandal with Uber is that they've probably had a decent amount of cases where drivers were taking advantage of their customers, and there had been cases where people were harassed and kidnapped, or other scandals, which will also be covered later in this presentation. So that would wrap up all the main four flaws that they originally had when starting off. But although they faced all of these large failures, they had also had many successes that were able to put them at the top of their kind of industry, I guess. So that'll transition us to their successes, which would be regulations in Washington, D.C. One of Uber's earliest and biggest successes was when Washington, D.C. created and passed their regulatory framework, which was one of their biggest failures on the past slide. So they actually had regulations that worked well and flourished with the company effectively, which they hadn't had yet in any other states. So that was their largest success, was starting off in Washington, D.C. at the time. Their second success would be making cars cheaper to buy for drivers. So, I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. They had a system paired up with car manufacturers, where they would basically let potential new Uber drivers purchase cars for a cheaper rate, to get more drivers that they needed for the company. Thirdly, they had getting millions of business accounts through Concur. So Uber paired up with lots of businesses so that these businesses would use their car service ultimately over any other car service or taxi service. But the biggest one was Concur, which is a expensing company. And they started potentially over 25 million new potential accounts with Uber, which was a huge success for Uber at the time when starting off. And then lastly, opening in China. So whenever Uber first started and they got their company started up in China, they were basically if you were to count up the number of rides for all of China, or the top 3 cities with the largest number of rides, all 3 cities would be in China and not in the US. So it was a very big success for Uber to start off like this in China when it's extremely hard for normal US startups to even start up well in China at all. So those would be the 4 main successes that Uber had when starting off, and I'll wrap up there.
Yeah, so just as he was saying, with all these many successes they've had, most of them did come while exploiting many loopholes in the legal system. So for example, when they were first starting out, and until this day, they have been classifying their drivers as contractors, claiming that time flexibility of the job and its use of personal vehicles exempts the company from providing labor benefits such as minimum wage and health insurance. This has been a huge factor in dissatisfaction from their drivers, since they are not actually stated as real employees. They don't get any of these benefits that most employees would around the world, around the country. So in August of 2013, Shannon Liss Reardon, who is an attorney, filed a class action lawsuit of California Uber drivers against the rideshare company. She stated that independent contractors run their own businesses. Uber drivers cannot be considered self-employed since the business ultimately belongs to Uber. She's really on the side of the drivers, trying to help them get their benefits that Uber is not allowing them to have. So Uber eventually did settle and agreed to give the drivers involved in the suit 37 cents per mile that they drove with Uber. The company also did make minor changes within the organization to better clarify the deactivation policy for the drivers. There was actually a lot of dissatisfaction coming from the drivers because they were trying to get out of the program, like for some reason they weren't, or when they tried to leave and they wanted to get back in, they were not allowed in. So this helped them better understand the rules within it, the company, that helped them get back in if they wanted to work again. So Reardon was actually satisfied with the settlement. However, she is still looking to stop these major companies from wrongly classifying its employees. So like I said, they are still to this day able to classify them as contractors instead of employees. She said that this is not the end of this issue of driver classification. We are continuing to pursue many cases against gig economy companies that are misclassifying their workers as independent contractors in order to save on labor costs and shift the risk of expenses of operating a business to their low wage workers. So this goes hand in hand with my last slide, how they have been exploiting it for years and how they still continue to. So when I said gig companies earlier, that means companies such as Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, any of these new companies that are popping up that are able to use what they call contractors to pick up orders, deliver people such as that don't have actual jobs at the company, but they work for them. And so these companies actually pushed a $200 million campaign to approve Proposition 22 this year in New York. In California. This was the most expensive campaign in the state's history. So this proposition was approved, and now this rejects the recently passed state law, which would have required the companies to hire their drivers as employees instead of contractors. So this past state law, actually, when it was trying to get pushed into effect, which would make them classify them as employees, which would actually give them their benefits. So like I was saying, this prevents these massive corporations from being required to pay their drivers the traditional benefits such as healthcare, sick pay, and workers' compensation. One analyst believes if this proposition was not approved, it would have costed the companies hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Shannon Liss Reardon voiced her concern, the attorney from earlier, for the future of work in the United States coming from the approval of Proposition 22. She stated that they were able to change the law in a way that suited them and allows them to save labor costs at all expenses of working people in this country. She's saying how companies like Uber are able to take advantage of the legal system by pumping millions and millions of dollars in it in order to get what they want. So what happened here was they were able to still classify their workers as contractors, which would relieve them of all the benefits that they were hoping to acquire. So next, we're going to be going to the psychological manipulation.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So as Matt previously stated, Uber's drivers are contractors, meaning that they have no entitlement to benefits and protections such as mandatory lunches and paying overtime. However, this lack of benefits is leveraged by the independence of drivers that are working on their own time. Proposition 22 and its approval is no coincidence. Uber's management has softened its approach due to sexual harassment allegations and evasion of regulatory scrutiny, and in the process created an environment in which drivers have so-called more control. According to an essay by Ryan Callow and Alex Rosenblatt, The Taking Economy in 2017, Uber officials are using what they know about drivers, their control over the interface, and the terms of transaction to channel the behavior of the driver in a direction that they want it to go. And to talk a little more about the history of Uber and their toxic workplace culture, Uber has become the subject of discussion for many management-centered courses for its infamous work environment. And it all began due to their CEO, Travis Kalanick, and his toxic workplace environment. Some would compare this culture to a fraternity behavior or be described as brotastic. In this environment, he encouraged workplace disputes, pitted drivers against each other, engaged in sexual harassment and active gender discrimination.
So moving on, I wanted to talk about the internals of Uber as a company rather than just how they're treating their drivers. Uber got a lot of negative press back in 2017 when a former engineer that worked at the company named Susan Fowler put out a blog post where she exposed many of the things that happened during her time at Uber. She and a number of other female employees came together and reported a manager for sexual harassment, but it was covered up, citing that the manager was a, quote, high performer, and that the department wouldn't do anything for it. The same manager was then reported on later, and the employee was told that this was the first time they had heard of any offense from that manager. On top of this, there was also sexist discrimination in the company, with female engineers not given the same Uber jackets that their male counterparts got because there were too few female hires in the company in order to order the jackets. On top of this, the HR department at Uber was just a broken system. Their former CEO, Travis Kalanick, saw HR solely as a way to hire and fire employees, and he didn't believe that it had any use outside of that. And so as a result, the HR department was scared to punish these high performers because it didn't have any other functions than to hire and fire. And so this led to a lot of stereotyping for Uber. They kind of got written up in the press as one of those money-hungry companies that just was out to make a quick buck. And so a lot of confirmation bias came among the consumers, where everybody started to see Uber as this terrible company that was never going to change. But they kind of have started to turn over a new leaf in recent years. Their former CEO, before he stepped down, and their current one have both said that Uber once had a fast-paced take on business, and now that they're slowing it down, they're going to focus on more internal problems that they have that clearly had become an explosion of problems. Their HR chief of staff, Leanne Hornsey, she stepped down in 2018 after reports that she had systematically ignored racial discrimination in the company. And this kind of came along after she stepped in with all of the sexual harassment allegations. And so she basically put in this system in the company that the employees could call out their superiors and they would actually see effective results because the HR department was operating as it should. And so that actually came back to bite her when she tried to pass off what would have been overlooked back in the old Uber. But now that she had put in this new system, she actually got caught up in her own system and resulted in her getting into a lot of trouble, and she eventually had to step down. So basically, still having some issues as a company, but they are doing their best to bring it back around and become a ethically well-behaved company.
So in conclusion, we've seen a lot, like we've talked about, a lot of issues within the company, internally and externally. Many of these issues have led to their success, actually, which unfortunately, hopefully they can change. But yeah, so that's it.